Hello everyone, my name is Ray Konopka with Ray Software, and in today's webinar we're going to be talking about FMX Animations and Tab Transitions. We have quite a bit of material to cover. We're going to start with some animation core concepts in the FMX framework. We're going to look at really what do we mean when we say animating anything in FMX, and what classes and capabilities are available for us to do these animations. We'll take a look at some ways to customize the animation. Actually, there's quite a few ways of customizing it, whether we use animation triggers or custom changes to interpolation and animation types. There's a wide range of capabilities, and by understanding these various core concepts, we can get some pretty cool animation effects in our applications. Once we get through the basics and the foundations of animating inside of FMX, we'll take a look at a pretty powerful technique that I use quite frequently whenever I need to synchronize animations. And this is an area where you have multiple things that are being animated, but if you animate them independently, there are some challenges. And I present a technique that overcomes most of those challenges and really leads to some cool effects. And then we're going to wrap up the webinar with a discussion of tab transitions, both from a mobile standpoint. I have a mobile application. Actually, I just took the template that comes from the IDE and built onto it. And so we want to see how can we deal with tab transitions? How do we add those to our applications? I walk you through all of that. I also have a Windows desktop application that leverages the tab transition capabilities as well. So lots of things to cover. Let's get started. So specifically, if we look at the FMX framework, most people think of cross-platform as the driving force behind FMX. You know, it's the UI toolkit that allows Delphi and C++ builder to build our applications to target Windows, of course, but you know, iOS, Android, Mac OS, so lots of cross-platform capabilities. However, ever since the beginning, you go way back to the roots of FMX, it has always been based on a very powerful animation and rendering engine that's built into the framework. And by learning some of the key concepts here, we can leverage that in our app and add some really nice things, nice behaviors to our FMX apps, whether it's mobile or desktop, you know, or both. The principle behind it all is that we are animating properties. So we have some object and we want to modify one of the property values over time. The most common ones that you will animate are these that are listed here. Position is a common one. I need to move, you know, an item that's in my form, whether it's a control or some, you know, image. I want to move from one place to another. And rather than just having it snap to the new location, it's a much more visual pleasing and context keeping process if we animate over that change. So if its position starts out at 0 and we need to change that to 100, having it animate from 0 to 100 over a certain time period really lends itself to a visual context and a smooth, modern looking UI. Size sometimes can also be animated. You may see this with selector controls, the old Rolodex type of interface where the currently highlighted item wants to be a little bit larger size so that you know that you have your mouse over that particular piece. So that's where we would do that. Fading in and out. When we're dealing with transitions between content is where the opacity property comes into play. So rather than just abruptly hide something and abruptly show it, we can fade out the old value and fade in the new value and get a much more smoother transition. A very fun animation property that's often used is the rotation angle. One of the really powerful features of FMX itself is the ability to rotate any of the controls that you have. The base FMX object allows for, well, FMX control allows for rotation. And so we can leverage that by animating it. And there's a number of other ways that we can animate properties, including color, for example, that I've listed there. So one thing to keep in mind, not that it really matters much, but when you're setting up the animations, you'll have to kind of remember this, but most of the properties, aside from color in this list, position, size, opacity, rotation angle, and many others are floating point properties, unlike the VCL, which was integer based. Why this is important is that because animation is determining an interim value between some starting point and some end point. And it's pure math, and there's a number of different ways in which those interim values can be calculated. With the addition of floating point numbers, we actually can be much more precise in that. We don't have to round to a whole number. The benefit is that we get much smoother animations by doing it this way. And so there we can get some really nice benefits here. So let's take a look at, so now we know what we can animate, but how do we do the animation? And what capabilities are included in FMX? And this is where the animation classes come into play. And there's several. And it all depends on what property you're trying to animate. So the most simplest animation classes allow you to animate between some start value and an end value. They call it stop value in these classes. But if I want to change an integer value from 1 to 100, I can do an int animation. That's kind of rare, to be honest. Most of the time you'll use the float animation, especially if it's a position, because the floating point, the position X and position Y values, position Z if you're doing 3D, those are floating point numbers, and so we can transition more smoothly, as I was just describing. So we can animate through color values, so we can start having, color is red, animated to blue, it'll do a smooth transition. The actual class knows how to animate gradually between two colors, so that's actually quite cool. Gradients, similar type of process. We can animate rectangles. That's kind of nice when you want to increase sizes and things. Same thing with bitmaps. Bitmap animations tend to get used in different transitions. But the key with all of these is that you are animating between a single start value and an end value. However, there are situations where you really want more control over that. You want to be able to vary or animate over a series of values that are in that your property value needs to go through. And I have an example of this in a little bit once we get into the demo portion to make it a little bit clearer. If you've done any type of animation and creating any type of movies, media player, and After Effects and so forth, the idea of key animation or keyframes will be quite familiar, and we have that same capability with these base classes. The final set, the final grouping, if you will, it's a group of one, is stepping through a list of values. So we're not trying to create interim values in between them. We just have a list of items, and this is really just for doing a slideshow, which is what this bitmap list animation gives us by default. So the animation classes themselves, all of those base classes I just described, all descend from a common ancestor, and the common properties that you'll see are things like start value and stop value. duration, how long of a time period will the animation take to go from the start value to the stop value. And if it's enabled, then the animation is running. If I disable it, then I'm turning off the animation and stopping it. Do I want the animation to repeat? I set the loop property to true for the animation object. What if I want it to go backward? So auto reverse might be useful to I proceed with my animation going forward, and then when it's done, it automatically turns around and does the opposite, essentially undoes what it just did. And by combining these various properties, we can get some really cool effects. There's also events available on the animation classes. On process is there, but frankly, it's very rarely used. Most of the time, you're going to, if you do need to respond to something, it's generally on the onFinished event, which you can chain events that way. I can start one, and at the end of the first animation, I can start up another one. Do things like that. That may be necessary if I don't want, if I'm animating two different things, and I need to have more control that one of the key animation frames, the float key or the color key, doesn't give me enough control. So I have an example a little bit later on where we go and use the onFinished event in a very cool way. So we've got some basics introductions. Lot more of this will be clearer when we get into the IDE and actually start animating some things. So I'm running Rad Studio 10.2 Tokyo Edition, and but I will point out that everything that I'm describing and talking about has been in ever since the first release of FMX. It is a core fundamental feature of the FireMonkey framework, is this animation capability. I'm also going to be leveraging the Radiant Shape components that are now available in the Get It Package Manager. They're just more fun to actually drop down and see things work. So to start, we're going to animate this arrow. And we're going to just kind of play with a couple different ways in which we can do this. I'm going to highlight a couple things that the IDE gives us as a way to indicate whether something can be animated or not. I'm going to go and grab myself a little button here just so that I can start and stop the animations as necessary. So if I go back to my Radiant arrow, and I'm not going to worry about the coloring or anything at this point yet, but one of the things I can even see right here off the bat is that these properties have a little film strip next to them, and that is an indicator that this is a property that can be animated. So we have the height, so again that's related to the size, the position. If I expand that, the X and Y values can change. Rotation angle can also be changed. So let's go ahead and what happens when we have a property that has that little film strip, that animation indicator there. Well, when you drop down, you get a little pop-up that tells us which type of animation we can create. So we'll talk about the key animation in a bit, but we're going to start with just a float animation. And I'm going to go and select that, and what you'll see is that there's a new object. This is that T float animation class. I have a new object of that type that is nested inside of my Radiant arrow. Now I don't see it, it's not a visual control, but it's related to my Radiant arrow. And if we look at it, because the parent of this is the Radiant arrow, if we look at the property name, that tells us that, okay, we're animating the rotation angle for this object, for the arrow that I have here. And so there's not a whole lot of properties here. We have some things like animation type and interpolation, which sound rather complex, and we're going to go over those in a little bit. But we just want to get started. So let's start our start value at 0. That's what rotation angle it is right now. And this is, the rotation angle is in degrees. So I want to spin it all the way around. But 0.2 of a second seems a little bit long. I'm going to change that to, let's make that 2 seconds. And I'll change that. I'm going to set the enabled property in code because I want to actually control what happens with it. And at this point, I'm not going to worry about looping or going reverse at this point. Let's just see what happens when we turn on this animation. So if I go into my code, and if we look, it's just a regular straightforward object. So I can do my float animation of 1 and set the enabled property to true. Go ahead and save all of that. Now when I go ahead and run this, if I set everything up correctly and I click the enabled property, I get my arrow animating very nicely, very smoothly over the 360 degrees. So that works out pretty well. Now, a couple other things. Let me run this again and show you what I was going to. I've rotate this 360 degrees. So what's actually happening during the animation is that the rotation angle property of the arrow is changing, and it's causing it to repaint and redraw itself. This is where the rendering engine comes in FireMonkey so that it's nice and smooth and we don't get a lot of flicker. At the end, the rotation angle is 360. So if I hit the enabled button again and I set it to true, nothing happens. Well, there's 2 reasons for that. One, I'm already at the end result, so I don't have to animate to the beginning. The second is that all I'm doing is changing the enabled property to true in here. Well, I need to reset it. So there's a couple ways to do that. One of the first things, and this, I don't really like this, but if you need to manually control the animation, this is one way to accomplish that. So if I turn it off and then reset it, it will restart the animation from the get-go. So click again, and now I get my animation. Not the best way. It's kind of silly that I would need to do that. A better approach would be to actually turn off the animation when it's done. So to do that, we go back to the animation object, go to the event, and put an event handler for the finished. And so in here, when we're done animating, let's turn it off. So now it's not sitting there being enabled when I don't need it to be. So now when I go ahead and animate it again, everything works great. So straightforward float point animation there. Let me go ahead and create another one. We'll use a different arrow type here, make it a little bit bigger. It's a little too big. And in this case, what I want to do, I'm going to add another button. And we're going to talk about the key animations. So we need to go over to our chevron arrow. And again, we're going to look at the rotation angle. And this time we'll create a float key animation. And one of the things you'll note from the get-go is that there's no start value and stop value anymore for this. Instead, there's a keys folder, a property that's actually a collection of keys that we will use to determine the various changes that we want to have happen. And so I'm going to go ahead and change this to be a 2-second animation again. We're going to keep all things else the same. We'll talk about triggers in a little bit. The key is, or the important piece is to go into the keys. And I'm going to create 4 different values here, or pairs. And now the key for this represents a percentage of the total duration, and that percentage is in a fraction of 1. So 0 is 0% and 1 is 100%. And so what I want to do, and this is also important, is that you need to have a key for the starting out point. So it's, as we have this entry in here, we know this is where we're starting. So I'm at the rotation angle of 0, so right at the start I'm at 0 degrees. If I go and my first item here, and I want to make this at 40% through the process, I want the angle to be 180. So 4/10 of my whole duration, so 40% along the way of time, I want the actual angle to be pointing straight down. In my next key, I want this to be 50%, so a little bit later, but I want it to actually go back to 150 degrees. So I'm changing the direction of my rotation in this sequence. So it's increasing from 0 to 1, the sections here. From 1 to 2, it's actually decreasing, going backwards. And then for the last one, which will be the end of the duration, I want it to be 360 degrees. Go ahead and close that. I'll add my button in here. So we should have a float key animation that will make enabled is true. And likewise, the float key animation has an unfinished, and we can go ahead and set that to false so that we can repeat it very easily. So let's go ahead and run it. And now when we run it, we see that it does a little bobble. And that's what the float key animation gives us, is that we can set up any number of these key value pairs to change the way the animation works. And so we could, alter it to make sure that it rotates really fast up until the end and then goes slowly for the last stage. Again, you have quite a bit of control over that. Continuing our discussion of the animation classes, one of the couple properties I didn't talk about when we were looking at the base introduction is the animation triggers. And we showed how, in the previous examples, how we started the animation by changing the enabled property. Well, you can actually have an animation start automatically by being triggered from some other property change. And this is built into the framework. And there are common triggers such as is mouse over, is drag over, is focused, or is visible. So all of the base visual controls that you can have will have these triggers available, which we can then respond to. There are additional triggers based on the control type. For example, button controls, things that are clickable, has an is pressed trigger, checkboxes have is checked, etc. We specify a trigger by defining a string that contains one or more trigger conditions. So as an example, is mouse over equals true and is pressed equals false. And it is an and. Each subcondition needs to be true in order for the trigger to be generated and result in the animation turning on. And so what we can do next is actually show how these triggers work. So let's switch over to Delphi again, and I'm going to switch my app to the trigger. Give me my little form here, and in this case we can take another fun shape, and that's a plain old one. We'll do something like that. And what we wanted to do is use a different type. We've done rotation angle, positioning and things. We'll see other examples of that later on. But for the trigger, I want to color this. And so let's give the shape itself a fill color. And so rather than this plain old gray. And so we can make it say coral here. That looks nice enough. And then we want to actually animate the color. So if you drop the color list down, go all the way to the end, we can get a new color animation. And I'm only going to change, to one color. I'm not going through a series of colors, so I don't need the color key. I'm just using a regular color. And so my start value, I can start from current, which will pick up what the current value is, or you can change it to be some other value that you wanted. And if I keep it to the coral and I change it to, let's see, find something that's a little bit, should lend itself well. I'll do a little Dodger blue there, orange to blue color. Of course, I could, put another button here, or if I clicked on it, cause the animation to fire. But what we really want to do is actually have the control do it for us, so we don't have to respond to that. And that's where the trigger comes into play. So I'm animating the fill property for this object, and I'm going to set the trigger that if I'm over the control, I want to turn on this animation. And so let's go ahead and run this. So as I move my mouse over, it does indeed change. And it's kind of interesting is it does it each time. You can see that because that's what I told it to do. I didn't tell it to do anything when I left the control. And that's where, if we go back to the animation object here, the trigger inverse, which is what we want to really do, is if we are no longer over the mouse. So is mouse over is now false because we've moved out of it. We're going to do the inverse of the animation that we did coming in. And so now when we go ahead and run this application, we see that it animates, changes to blue, I animate out, and it changes back to the coral. So again, another way that we can do to highlight things as we move to them. This is very similar to hot tracking that goes on to button controls by default. They have built-in capabilities to respond to that, use those triggers to have that. We could also add in other effects like glow effects and so forth to make that work. And maybe a second is a little bit too long for this. If you wanted it to go quicker, we can do fractions. So, half a second, run this again real quick, and we can see that it comes to the blue and goes back to the coral color very quickly. So the triggers are quite powerful. And then you can set up multiples of them, which all the conditions need to be true in order to make that work. Okay, the next step that we want to talk about is interpolation. And interpolation is how the values from the start to the end, how fast do they change? Do they change at the same rate through the whole process? So for a given time duration, we divvy up that time into an even set of stop points, and we recalculate the new values, and then we figure out what the interim value between start and stop needs to be. The default is linear, which is really easy. You know, you take the stop value minus the start value, you get that length, figure out what values you want to create in between that, take your duration and create up a constant rate of change over that duration. However, we're really just getting into math now. When you apply change rates over time, you can apply a curve to that. So the framework, the animation classes, have an interpolation property that allow us to use different mathematical curves to alter the way in which the values in between the start and the stop are calculated. And here are the other values aside from linear. So you have quadratic, cubic, quartic, quintic, sinusoidal, exponential, circular. Those are all very similar. It's a curve where the slope of the curve changes over time. How that slope of the curve changes over time is defined by the type. So quadratic is squared, cubic is cubed, quartic is is power of 4, etc. And the other values, elastic, back, and bounce, aren't just an ever increasing curve. They actually have some peaks and valleys into it, and because of that, the value that we create for a given time in between start and stop will be different. And by applying a different interpolation, we can get some pretty interesting animation effects. Right now, everything that I've done so far has been straight linear, so gradual smoothness through the whole thing. But that gets a little boring. I will add that the help inside of the IDE does have quite detailed information about each of these, the actual mathematical formula for the curve, if you're interested in learning more about it. There's one other property that's important when we talk about interpolation, and that's animation type. And this describes how the mathematical curve is applied to the changing range of values. So the default is in, which is kind of weird, but it really means the start. So at the beginning of the animation, the curve is applied and it will affect the rate of change over those values. The opposite is the out. So at the end of the animation, any variance in the curvature is applied at that point. In out means it's done at both. And so it does at the beginning and does the same thing at the end. It's symmetrical. Depending on what you want to accomplish, you will switch between all of these. However, describing it is very cumbersome. It's something that you really need to see it. And so that's what we're going to take a look at next. So here's the example program that I'm going to use to demonstrate the interpolation. I don't have all of them represented here, but most of them are. Most are very similar in the way the curve affects the output. And most of the code that we see inside of the form is all modifying the various animation objects based on these settings. So common properties, I just go ahead and change all of them. The key thing is I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we're just going to take a look to see how each of these interpolation values affect the animation of each circle and or ring. And the animation is simply in the Y position, animating vertically for each one. So if I go ahead and animate, we can see that they all get to the bottom at the same time. It's 2 seconds, but each one does it a little bit different. And so a couple things to note. This is linear, so it's just a straight constant change all the way from top to bottom. The circular, cubic, and quadratic are based on curves, a slope that ever changes in the direction that you're going. How fast it changes is what's different in each of these equations. And so as you can see is they all go down, kind of go a little bit faster than they slow down. How fast they go is based on the equation that's used. The last three here are the kind of the funky ones, where the bounce kind of bounces and then goes, the backs up a little bit and then moves forward. The elastic, it kind of almost like a rubber band where it kind of bounces a little bit and then snaps into place. So if you take another look, I'll animate a couple more times and you can see that. And what's interesting is the default animation type is in. When most of the time though, for things that we're doing like this and we're changing these, we really want it to be on the out. So what this means is that we're going to start out kind of quicker, and then we're going to do the curvature application when we get toward the end. So simply by changing the animation type, and I'm going to animate again, we can see that it's much more in line of what we expected. So they all start from the top, they fall down and gradually go to place. The back button does its little back and it kind of gradually goes into place like it's on a cushion. And then likewise, it's got this the bounce effect and then the elastic. So if you go and see those, there's a much better change of that. The in-out means that it happens on both sides. So it bounces, then bounces, and if we go ahead and put it in a loop and go backwards, we can see it do all those pieces. So it just kind of goes back and forth. The linear just goes nice and steady the whole process, even though they all end up at the top and bottom at roughly the same time. But it looks much better when it's just the out. And then it kind of bounces back up, bounces down for each of those different pieces. So one of the challenges that you can run into when animating properties is that you might actually have multiple properties, multiple objects that you want to animate in a similar way, and you want to keep them synchronized. Unfortunately, it can be a little tedious. One, you have to create animation objects for each of the properties and the objects, just because of the way that works. But the other issue that you have to watch out for is that depending on what you're animating in the time, it's possible for the animation, the objects, to get out of sync. And what I mean by that is if you're trying to animate two things to be exactly the same relative distance to one another, say as you're moving it, if you animate them separately, it's possible that they could be jumping over each other a little bit in the sense of how the calculation's done. They may not be perfectly in sync. And so in order to get around that, I'm going to show you a technique that I've used quite often to get around this same particular issue. And it's all accomplished by defining a new property that we do the animation over, but then at each change we can update any number of objects based on the animation values. So this is a really cool way to keep everything that we're trying to animate synchronized. To demonstrate this, I have a program that I call Digit Drop that will demonstrate synchronizing the properties. So let's take a look at what that is all about. So I'll switch to my Digit Drop app and we'll bring up the form. And what it's designed to do, let me go ahead and run it real quick so that we can get a feel for what I'm animating, and then we can describe how we did it. And so let me go ahead and run this. And it's a display, and there's nothing on it yet until I pick a value. So if I pick 120, then the digits come and drop down from the top and fall into place. If I change the value, notice that you see the old values and the new ones. I need both of those sets to be in sync for the correct approach. I can change the interpolation value. I'm using a custom kind of logical terms, but then as I go and change them, notice how it gradually falls into place. The decelerate doesn't have any kind of bounce. It just falls in and snaps down to where it needs to be. Constant looks very odd in this case, where it just slowly gets down. So we'll go back to the regular bounce and snap those in. So what is actually being done in the animation here? Well, the structure, there's a layout control that we're going to size based on the cell size, and there's 6 other text boxes in here. 3 for the current values, that's what these 3 are, and then 3 for the next values that are sitting up out of view, and then when I drop them into place, I need the top text box and the bottom text box to move in tandem. I don't want them to change their relative position to one another. So that's where we're using this synchronized technique of creating a new property. Now, another thing to note is that I didn't use any of the designer capabilities to create these. And the reason for that is because I've defined new properties on the form to accomplish this. So let's scroll down into the private section here. This is just support stuff. The key pieces are these new properties called digit ones position, digit tens, and digits hundreds. The properties are defined out here. Each time they are changed, the set digit ones position or tens or hundreds functions get called. I'm going to animate those property values. I'm not animating the actual text boxes. I'm animating these new properties using these new animations that I'm going to dynamically create. And then when I'm done with the animation, I'm going to update some of the cells, and we're going to take a look at each of these different pieces here. So let's scroll down to the form create, which is pretty straightforward. Initializes some base values, what kind of drop style, how long the animation is going to be, and then creates the animation objects. And so, of course, I need interpolation values based on what I've set my drop style enum to. So bounce goes to bounce. Cushion is my more friendly term for back. Decelerate for quintic, and constant for linear. Make the correct changes. If drop style is not set, then I go ahead and set it to bounce if it's some other value. And then the key here, these are the animation objects that I'm defining. And they're owned by the form, they're parented by the form. So that's whose property name digit one's position is being animated, the form's property. I set up its start and stop values, and the interpolation and animation type. The duration, I don't need a loop, and then I'm setting up that it's going to execute this function, this method, when it's finished. And so you can see how I'm animating each 3 of these, the ones, the tens, and the hundreds position. The only thing that's different between the 2 or 3 of these is that I've set up a little offset on each of the durations so that when I go and run it, they don't all fall into place at the exact same time. They're a little bit different, and that gives a much kind of more fun bounce effect between each of the cells. But other than that, that's what's getting animated. It has nothing to do with the actual text boxes. That will come later. So set value is simply when I make it, click on one of those radio buttons, I need to change the value being displayed by the text boxes. That's what's done in this method. Takes the value, figures out which text cell, the ones, tens, hundreds digit needs to go into each layout for the next value, and then it starts the digit drop, which is just down below. These methods are just getting which digit, making the change, changing the interpolation value, setting the clipping size, all of that. Now if we go to start digit drop, we're just starting each of the 3 animations. Boom, boom, boom. And because they're each animating different things, different pairs, that's okay. That's what I want. I've actually cut my animation objects down in half. I could do it all in one if I didn't want them to be a little bit different. If I all wanted them to fall in place at the same time, I could have done it with one property. The key here is that each of these, when I make a change to the digit 1's position, I'm actually changing two controls. I change the text value position based on what's coming in from the animation engine, and then I adjust the position of the next value to be right above it. So no matter where I move this one, the text value, the next value will be right above it. And that's what gives us this really smooth animation between the two text boxes. And then each cell does that. When I'm finished, the last step is that I need to reset the controls with their content for the next go around. So because the text boxes went off screen, I need to bring them back and put the right data in them, and I need to reset the next value boxes to be above and out of view. And that's what these three finished routines do. So for the final section, I want to talk about tab transitions. The tab control in FMX is quite powerful. It even includes built-in support for slide animations, which is great for the mobile side because using a tab control to partition into multiple views, being able to slide between them is actually quite cool and follows the pattern that's usually on those devices. The problem is that ability is kind of hidden. It requires adding an action list and some actions to your application in order to surface that ability. So we're going to take a look at a couple apps that demonstrate how to use tab transitions. So here's an application. It's a mobile app for targeting the iOS simulator for now on this particular machine, but it's built off of the tab template. So it's a standard new application, multi-device, tabbed interface. I've changed the tab positions to be none so that I don't end up seeing them. Let me change it to my tab control. So tab position is none. It's platform default by default. I'm only using the first two tabs. The first represents a list of items. I click on a list of one of the items, and then I get a detail page, and I want to slide that one into view. I want to slide it back, but I haven't surfaced any of that right now. The only thing I've added is this list box. I've added a back button that I make visible when I'm on this secondary page, and then go ahead and make the change. If we look at the code for this, we can see that when we click the list box, we just change the tab control item. When we hit the back button, we just change back to the previous tab. So let me go ahead and run this. It does a quick little compile. And we have our tab transitions application. So when I go ahead and click on it, it immediately snaps to the secondary tab, which is my new view. Okay, that's okay, but it's really not the effect that we want. So what I'm going to show you next is how do we get the tab transitions in our application. And it's quite easy. So we're going to go back to the main form. I'm going to add an action list to my form. I'm going to bring up the action list editor, select new standard action, and you can multi-select to bring them both in, which is quite nice. And since they're both selected, I can set them both to be this tab control that I'm working with. So this allows me to set up multiple actions for different controls if I wanted them to have that ability. The one thing to note, there's a couple properties that are specific to these actions, and that is direction, which tells me the way in which I'm sliding, which is defaults to normal, which for left to right cultures means it slides from the right side to the left. So I'm moving in that direction. The opposite is reversed, which does the opposite. The reason why it's normal and not left to right or right to left is because if you're in that locale, that orientation will change. the other property of interest is transition, which is either slide or none. So fortunately, slide is the default, which is what we want. None was what I just showed. It just snaps to the new view. So at this point, now that I have the actions, I can actually modify my code to use them. So I'll comment that out. And when I click the list box, I'm going to go to the next tab action, execute. Likewise, when I hit the back button, I want to do the previous tab action, execute. And since they're connected to this control, it will operate correctly. So let me go ahead and rebuild this version and let's send it over to the simulator. Almost done, copying it over. And so now we have the simulator. Now when I click it, notice how the whole page slides over and the new one comes in. Same thing when I hit the back button. So it actually does the animation that I want. But we can do more than just these straight animations. I have another application that will demonstrate that. It's my wizard. This one is a desktop application, and if we look at the form, I'll run it again. I'm not having any tabs. I have a kind of a wizard. I click the next button and we'll see what shows up. And so I click the sample button and I have 3 buttons coming up from the bottom into position of what I want. And so if I go back, it slides back. So I'm using the tab transitions plus an additional animation to get these buttons into position. So how did I do that? Well, surprisingly, the tab transitions uses the action list just like the previous example. Animating the items on the next page is only done in the next button. So if we look at it, this is all the code. I create a generic list of the capsules. These are the shapes that I'm using, so I can iterate over them. And then when I click the next button, I position for each capsule where it needs to be at the start, which is below the screen, below the form, so it's out of view. And I put it at position X because it's roughly in the center of my display there. I set up a gap size for the spacing between each button, and I calculate for each capsule what is its ultimate Y position. So it's the offset plus the height and the gap multiplied by the factor of what capsule number. And then I use a new function, new class called tAnimator, which has a number of animate functions on it that allow us to, we don't have to create an animation object for it. We just want to do a one-off. So it does all the work for us. So we just tell it which object we want to animate over, which is the capsule that we're iterating over. We want to animate the position Y and give it a new value. We want it to take 0.7 of a second to do the animation. And the important piece for this example is we want to use a delay. We don't want it to start just because we click this button. Remember, we haven't even switched the page yet. We're just setting it up for when we do switch it, 0.4 of a second later will cause this to animate up. And we're using out animation type and then Quartic because it kind of slowly goes into play. And since each one is animating a different distance, that gives the effect, because they all start out the same, that they come in at different rates, which is kind of a neat effect. And so if we go ahead and run this one again, you can see that again why those snap up. And again, if you adjust the delay, that will control how soon it starts to animate up or how long after it gets to that page. Well, we've come to the end of my sample applications. I hope you got some detailed information about how animations work in FMX and want to tackle that in your own applications. I will be joining the live Q&A, hopefully answer any questions you might have in our remaining time. Any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I have started a new Delphi blog, resurrecting my old magazine column name, so be sure to stop by, check out that. And then, as I mentioned before, all of the sample applications are available at that URL that's listed. Again, thank you for spending the time, and I hope you learned quite a bit on FMX Animations. Thank you.
Okay. That was absolutely awesome. Ray, are you there?
I am.
Excellent. That was a brilliant session, and so there's quite a few questions that have been coming in, and quite a few people saying, yeah, it's great, thank you. Okay. Yes, Jens, size can be animated. Yeah, okay, I think I get where you're going there. So there was a couple of questions to start off here. Is there any kind of difference between setting animated true or calling animation start?
They're related. Changing the enabled property will change it. We'll start the animation if it's not already running. You get the auto start that comes into play. It was actually some good questions that came up with respect to that. I ended up highlighting it simply because it's an issue that I've seen people run into where they use the animation. I think some early demos kind of leveraged that, and then people kind of got stuck. If you do use the start method to start the animation, you don't need to turn it off. Which can be done in tandem. It's actually kind of nice to be able to say, start that animation whenever you want. If it's disabled, then it won't matter. So they kind of go in tandem. Okay. But I've seen both used, which it can cause some issues, which is why I show kind of that example.
Okay, and there's a question here. How can you apply multiple triggers to an animation?
Yeah, I saw that, and I was going to type into it, but I figured it'd be easier to kind of describe it because it all depends on what you want to accomplish. So if the key is that an animation object can have one trigger and one trigger inverse. So for that animation to automatically start up based on the trigger conditions, that's what you specify in that property. Now you can connect multiples together. So is mouse over equal to true, semicolon is pressed equals true, or is pressed equals false. So both of those conditions need to be valid, then the animation will start. So that's how you would do something like moving over a button and you want hot tracking to be turned on. You wouldn't just do it mouse over, because when you click it, you'd still get that animation being around. And so now if you needed to do multiple trigger conditions that were essentially unrelated, they weren't, they were mutually exclusive. In that case, you could create an additional animation object and set up the trigger for that. You can actually create multiple animation objects and connect it to the same object's property. So that would be the way to handle that.
Okay, cool. I hope that answers your question, Casper. Interesting question from Jens here. Basically saying, if you've got a object that is, or a control that's aligned center, for example, and you might want to run some animation on that, is there any way to be able to do that? I'm guessing you probably have to disable the alignment and then do the animation. But
yeah, in his follow-up question where he talks about
grid layout controls.
For the grid layout controls. So that's the issue you're going to have is if you are, think of it even more simply if you get rid of the grid layout control, but if you just had a regular layout or even just a control that I was going to align to the left, for example, and if I try to animate that position, remember, I'm actually dynamically changing the real position of the control. So when I go and try to make that property change, the alignment code's going to come in and overwrite that and say, no, 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 you told this to be left. It's going to snap it back to be left. So typically, if you want to do something like that, you would almost always create a second layer, either whether it's a separate layout or an image that you would essentially take a capture of what you want the screen to look like, animate the objects into place, and then when the animation's done, you would essentially hide that and the real layout would be below.
Okay.
But the only other option that you would have would be to not have the objects parented into the grid layout, have them as separate, animate them into the logical position, and then reparent them to the grid cell. You could probably do it that way. The key, I think, to his bottom line question was getting the coordinates from each of the layouts. That I don't know off the top of my head. My guess is that you should be able to get that from the control, but that might require creating a descendant to get some of the access to the implicit sizes of the cells from the component.
Yeah, the other thing you might be able to do is if there's specific animation, or if you're wanting to use things like the effects and use animations on the effects, but keep the control in its position, then I guess you could do some stuff there because you haven't then got to worry about moving it around. And if you create a descendant of it, you can then apply the animations inside that descendant as you create it.
Sure.
That might be a way to get around it. So it depends if you need to move it, if it's within the grid or not. Okay. There was a couple of questions around tab active or setting the active tab. Was there anything that you wanted to kind of reiterate around that area?
Well, for those who aren't looking at the questions or the chat responses, I mean, it's a good thing to bring up. The tab control itself does have a method called set active tab with transition, which will allow you to switch to a new tab and actually have it do the slide animation, which is nice. It is certainly a viable option. The only downside to that, I guess if I would have a preference for the actions themselves, is that the actions do allow you to connect them to user interface controls. So it's really easy to actually connect it to the back button that you might have on a form or some other UI elements depending on what you're doing. But it is certainly a viable option to if you're going to do all of that in code. And that would make it quite simple to make that transition.
Yeah. And there's a message from Soma here. Is there any kind of benefit to animating 3 buttons separately rather than just putting them in a layout and then animating the layout?
Yes, there is actually. This is a great question. And I tried to kind of allude to it a little bit in the drop digit example, which is sort of similar, but in the wizard example, if I were to put the buttons into a layout and animate the layout, the effect would be is that all of the buttons would come up in the same rate based on whatever interpolation value I set for the layout. But the relative positions between the 3 buttons would remain fixed based on the relative positions inside the layout, which is certainly an option, and it would certainly work and bring up the buttons. But if you look closely, if you slow down the animation in there, what you'll see is that the top button comes in faster. And so they actually start out about, they're at the same position below the visible area of the form, and since the top button has longer to travel than the bottom button, and they're all starting from the same spot, the speed at which they move varies. And it actually gives this spread out look as they come up, which was more of what I was looking for.
Yeah, I think it's quite nice sometimes to have the flexibility to make the UI do something different to kind of lead the eye through what it's doing. Are there any differences to the way animations work across the different platforms, or should they, once you do this and set it up, it should just work everywhere?
It's the same base classes that the rendering engine is there. I mean, there's some, if you really get low level and you start looking at the what things are running off the GPU and the platform specifics, but from a logical standpoint, the animations are animations, and I haven't yet run into any issues across platforms that I can recall.
Okay, so Mark, if you found something that you're not quite sure, then feel free to just pop an example up into Quality Central, and just let myself or one of the other team members here know the item. We'll have a look. A number of people saying this has really helped them with understanding how to use animations, some good tips and tricks around how to use it as well. And it sounds like, in terms of the actions and setting up and using actions, Jens is saying that he's been doing app tethering and using some of the actions remotely, which sounds like a fun thing to do.
Yeah, that's kind of neat though too, if you think about it. With all the connected abilities that have been added into Rad Studio and the platform, it gives us quite a bit of flexibility to come up with some pretty impressive, immersive user interfaces. So this was actually one of the most exciting things. I know the big motivation was like, oh, this is going to give us cross-platform stuff, but I've been wanting to have more refined UI experiences, more animation capabilities, transparency, opacity. Those are things that, I've used all of these techniques in production systems to provide a much more immersive, rich experience, even though it's still a Windows application running on the desktop. The benefit is hey, we've got this stuff in cross-platform as well. So a lot of cool power stuff in there.
Yeah, it is very good to have all those different things. I think even at the simplest level, something like the glow effect, being able to hit submit on a form and automatically just colour the controls that are not there, and being able to kind of have that fade in and fade back out. It's such a simple thing, but if you haven't got a dialogue to read or a message to read or stars to look for somewhere, it's just blatantly obvious like that. It just adds that little extra to the usability of your applications that makes things move a lot faster. So that's very, very
right.
Cool.
The tricky part is not to overdo it.
Yes.
Where you really want it to enhance the user interface and not detract from it.
Yes. Yeah, just Jens's comment about using actions and app tethering just kind of made me think of doing a form to put up on a projector, and then as people try to type into it, moving the control remotely using some animations via a remote app tethering application. That could be kind of fun. So completely pointless but fun. Sounds like something for a dark side of Delphi session or something. There's a question from Samir here. Is there anything different between using animations in 3D compared to 2D?
At the surface level, no. In the sense that an animation, if you think about it, at its basic tenet, is that I'm taking a property value and I have some start value and I want to get to an end value. And I can get to that end value in any number of different ways. I can go right to it, hence no animation, no gradual change. Or I can break that range up into equal amounts and then over time go to each of those values, and then I get to my end result after some duration. The interpolations allow us to change how fast we go through that range? Are we, you know, is it constant speed? Am I accelerating at the beginning and then slowing down as I approach the endpoint, and vice versa? So at that level, applying the same principles to 3D space works. One of my very first projects was to where I leveraged a lot of this animation was to animate, to make a clock that mimicked an old Solari split flap clock, which was like in train stations. You know, you see the flaps that flip, and that was all done in the 3D form, and the actual digits, the images of each flap, I animated in 3D space, which was one of the rotation angles based on that coordinate. So that was something so you can do the same transitions in 2D or 3D. Principles are the same.
That's very cool. Like, Samir, one of the things I'd definitely say, if you're looking at doing some 3D animation or any 3D work in FireMonkey, definitely worth having a look at the T-dummy. That's one of those things that can really, really help. If you parent the controls inside a dummy, you can then animate the dummy to move blocker controls around together, which is quite often useful in 3D space. If you're definitely looking at doing some 3D work, have a look for the skill sprints that Pavel Glowacki has done on FireMonkey 3D. They would definitely help you get moving as well. Okay, I think that pretty much brings us to the end of the questions today. Some really good questions on top of a really awesome webinar, so thank you very much, Ray.
Well, you're very welcome, and I'll see you at the next session.
Okay, so if you do have any further questions, then please feel free to jump on. I think it's probably about another 4 hours from now is the next session running through. So Ray will be back online, and Jim McKeith will be hosting you through that session. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Ray, and happy coding, everyone.
So there's a few questions here. One of which is, it would be suggestion by Mark that it would be nice to have a disable on finish property of an animation instead of having to disable it manually. But you said there's a workaround for that.
Well, yeah, I was responding to it, and actually it was kind of a casualty of an edit. As I was putting all this together, I had lots of stuff to cover, and I was running late on time. And what ended up happening, there is another way of starting the animation, and that's actually using the start method that each animation object has. There's a corresponding stop one as well, and if you use that, then you can start it repeatedly and it will continue to run as long as the enabled property is true. But that issue with the enabled property I wanted to highlight, because that's one of the things I often see people struggle with, is they turn that on, it turns on the animation, and then it can't start up again. So that was if you use the start method, you don't really need to worry about doing that. So that's why I said you really don't need to have an auto disable capability, but you can with using the event unfinished event handler if that's what you need.
All right, great. That number drop you did, actually, I made a program a while ago that was like a slot machine, you know, with the numbers switching by. It was random. It was a random number generator was the idea. And I had that same thing where they're getting out of sync. So it was good to see that you had a nice solution for that.
Yes, actually, one of the original animation projects I worked on was to mimic a Solari split flap clock, which is the 3D. I modeled it in 3D using the form 3D, but it was also it's what you see at airports and train stations where the times flip like the old alarm clocks.
Right.
And with that, you have the front and back of the little flap that you're trying to animate in the 3D space. And it was, the problem I had is as it's running through, sometimes the back panel would come in front of the first one, and it was trying to keep them all in sync because I was animating them as two separate objects. And the trick was essentially the same technique I demonstrated, was to animate something different and then base your UI changes in position or spatial relativity based on the shared interpolated values.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I had someone suggest that was a bug. I was like, well, not really, because it doesn't know that's what you want it to do. So it's going to run them all in separate threads. So that makes sense when you think about it. Let's see. Why have you coded the transition of the capsule buttons from the bottom to the center and didn't use 3 float animations for the top property?
Why did you code transition from the bottom to the center and didn't use 3 float animations for the top property? Well, essentially 3 float animations did get used because that's what the TAnimator class will use. And so part of it was, one, to show a different way in which to do that, where I don't have to create the animation objects and have them sitting around. They end up getting created when I need them, and then they're discarded. So that's kind of the benefit there, and it's also a nice clean way of doing the delay, which was the other effect that I wanted to emphasize in that example.
Yeah, when I found that TAnimator class and started using that, I found that was a lot better. I mean, sometimes it's nice to be able to do the animations at design time, but I found doing them in code was, for me, a lot smoother. But I guess it's nice to have both options available, that's for sure.
Yep.
So let's see. There's a question about the demo ad projects being available, and the link's up on the screen right now.
Yep.
And Christian's asking, is it possible to trigger the transition to the same tab? For example, not changing tab, just doing the animation.
Is it possible to trigger the...
So I guess once you do a push, but then not have it switch what tab it's on, just push what's over from the left to the right, for example, and have it show the same thing again.
Well, I'm not quite sure if I think there's 2 fundamental questions in this, and I'm kind of not quite sure what's being asked, so I'll answer them both. The built-in support for the tab transitions it's essentially built in, so it applies when I am changing tabs. So changing to the same tab, I would not expect anything to happen because there's essentially no change. I'm having trouble coming up with an example of why we would want to do this, but if you needed to simulate the transition of the same information coming back in, you most likely would have to manage that yourself with a separate animation, like taking a screenshot, a bitmap rendering of the current display, the current tab control, and then animating that into place and then hiding it so that you see the same content. But I think there might be more to what's really trying to be accomplished than that.
Yeah, I did a session a while back on animations, and that's what I'd used a lot of, is the take screenshot function and then animating between that and something else.
Yep. Which
is really pretty powerful. And actually I did one where I was doing a transition between 2 panels and had animations on the transitions and showed that the animations were active and the buttons were active during the transition, which was pretty impressive. So actually, one thought I was thinking about why you might want to do that, and so something I thought about in the past is, let's say you're doing like a viewing a collection of photos, for example. So let's say I have 1,000 photos. I don't want to create 1,000 tabs for that, but I want to have that swipe between animation for each tab.
Right.
So how would you tackle that if you wanted to be able to swipe between what appeared to be an infinite number of tabs but was really not?
Well, that's the thing, is I don't think necessarily the tab control is the vehicle to do that. Like you said, you wouldn't create 1,000 tabs for each one of those, but if the tabs are, you have to think of, remember, the tabs pages, the tab items are like views. So the view isn't what's changing, the content is changing. So in that example, if my tab 1 is my list of albums, tab 2 is my view of the photos in that album, then what I'm going to animate with the gesture is an image control or something, or a panel that's on that tab. And as I swipe left or right, before I do the swipe, I've already set up the new image in the background or to the left, right or left side of what I'm swiping, so that when I do the swipe over, I'm either revealing the background image that's already there, kind of like the digit drop example, or or I guess like the button one, or the digit drop where I'm sliding it in at the same time I'm sliding the other one out. So I wouldn't use the tab animations at all in that case.
Sure, that makes sense. So Mark's saying that he was creating some vertical slide animations and have tried 3 different transition effects that all work on Windows but fail on Android. Shows the start and stop states with no animation in between. So if this is in Tokyo, there were some changes around threading in Tokyo, and there's a hot fix coming out for that in the near future. So that could be what's going on. Can you think of anything else that might be going on with that, Ray?
Nothing came offhand. The similar type of question. Somebody was saying that they were having trouble on Android this morning, and that would be my only guess. Is that it's a low-level issue in the rendering or maybe the thread management that would cause that. But from a logical point, the animation objects are pretty high level, but good to hear a hotfix on that's coming, so hopefully that addresses this particular issue.
Yeah, they've been working on it. So there was, just so everybody knows, there was a huge change to the way threading works in Tokyo for Android specifically. And it's a huge step forward. It was a huge architectural change, but it was discovered that some of the, there was a few side effects that weren't expected. And so they're working on a hotfix that's going to fix a lot of those things. But the result is going to be some much improved Android performance and much greater flexibility. In the near future, we're going to have more, we're going to have native controls on Android, which wasn't possible before with the old threading model. So that's going to be great. Okay, well, I think that's it for questions, unless you see anything I missed there. I usually jump around a little bit. Oh, also, Ernest pointed out that the animations are not very smooth on GoToWebinar. That is an unfortunate side effect of GoToWebinar. They will be smooth in the replay, which you should all get an email with a link to the replay, and you can watch them there. So, or just download the code and run them yourself. That's what I do. These animations are so cool, and actually I love when you do these, Ray, because you always do such a good job of making them look really, really nice. You have a good eye for design.
Thank you. Well, part of it is you want to kind of make it simple enough for people to understand and grasp the concepts, and then but give them kind of a taste of how you can go further with it and what we can do. And so, yeah, the rendered examples. The only requirement is you will need to, if you're using Tokyo or Berlin, and is get the Radiant Shapes package, which is through Get It, and then you can just install those because it's making use of the shapes just because they're more fun than the standard things and the regular controls. And then that should be it, but all of it's pretty standard.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think we're done then. Thank you so much, Ray, and thanks to everybody else for joining us for this presentation. And we'll see you all online next time. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.
So that was awesome, Ray. I really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you.
I've played a little bit with animations, but only just the basic stuff, moving stuff around, and didn't venture into what all of the interpolations meant. So that was really clear and really sort of went deep. So it was good.
Wonderful. Certainly appreciate the feedback. The animations is one of those areas from when we first heard that FireMonkey was coming, and it had this animation engine and rendering system, that I got real excited, because a lot of what I do is enhancing the user interfaces, and wanted to really leverage that to create something just went a little bit more, a little further. A lot of visual signage, visual displays, kiosks, those kinds of things that I've worked on have really benefited from the ability to do these types of animations. And actually many, if not all, of the tips that I showed in there were things that I ran into in production. One of the first animation signage that I needed to do was mimicking a Solari split flap clock like you see in a train station or an airport, the old alarm clocks, where the flaps would flip down as you changed time. And I was using a 3D form in FireMonkey, and I had, when you do the flip, you have the top flap from the current number that's visible, but then on the other side of that you have the bottom flap for the next number. And I remember running into these problems where I had them both, I animated them as separate objects. So I set up the animations for each one and I rotated them in 3D space through the rotation angle, and I kept seeing these weird artifacts where the back panel would show in front of the first one even though there was depth, and it really didn't work the way I wanted it. And that was where I came up with the technique of, well, you know, these are just animating over properties. Let me define my own and animate over that. And as that changes, I can do whatever I want. So that's where, that was the very early example I did that kind of led to the drop digit example that was there.
Yeah, and would help you avoid, because as the complexity of the animations you want to do and the, you know, just not just a single animation, but the sequence of animations you want to do grows, you end up with this potentially a mess of design time sort of artifacts that you're trying to corral into behaving as a single sequence of activities. So that kind of nicely gives you one place to see what's going on.
Exactly, and it's, as you do more and more, you'll find that you include more code that manages your animations rather than doing it all at design time. Certain things it works really well. Just if you want to animate something very simply and it's pretty self-contained, go ahead and add it in, you know, at the form level in your designer. As you do more and more things and you're relating across multiple properties, you start doing some more in code. It's nice having that flexibility to choose, you know, how you want to approach a particular problem. One of the things I will add, it was kind of a casualty of the editing, since this was a long one and I had more information and I kind of was trimming things down to kind of make it fit. I mentioned at the beginning, and this came up in the other sessions, and so I'm sure someone who's watching this one may have the same question, is I was using the enabled property to turn and start and stop the different animations, and described a potential problem that often confuses people when they first start out, and essentially re-enabling the control. You can actually avoid that by using the start method. There's a start method on each animation objects which will actually start the animation, and you can call start again to start it over, and it's actually a little bit cleaner. But I have seen I wanted to make sure I mentioned the enabled issue because it really kind of stops people. They try that and then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore, and they often figure out, oh, I don't know what happened, why doesn't the animation work? Yeah. But I think we have a question or two that came in.
Yep.
How would we make a button pulse? So there's a couple different ways in which you can do this. One of the things that's actually quite nice is with the effects that are built into FMX, they're separate entities from the animations, but they can often be used in tandem. So there's a glow effect, which, for the sake of argument, we'll just say it's an effect, and rather than a pulse, you could, the pulsing could be a glow effect becoming more intense and then reducing. And one way to do that is to change the opacity of that, or the intensity value that's used in the radius for the glow effect. So since that's a property, you can animate over that. And depending on how you want, if you just wanted it to always be pulsing, that's pretty straightforward. You essentially set up the effect on the button, which is set up in a very similar way that the animations do, but you actually use a component from the palette, drop it onto your component, and connect them that way in the structure pane. Now that glow effect will affect your component, so the button in this example, and then you can animate over the properties of the effect to get yourself a pulsing button, if you will.
Cool, makes sense. So, and it's a good reminder, I think, that you can easily fall into the trap of limiting your definition of animations to things moving on the screen, whereas, as you pointed out at the beginning, the animation is not about moving the component, it's about changing the value of a property.
Right. Actually, one of my favorite animation situations, if you will, is to, when you're doing some sort of transition, a lot of what I've done in my other job is working for the Walt Disney Company for parks and resorts, and I'm responsible for a lot of the signage that is associated with the various attractions, like the standby wait. And when that changes, you really don't want the number, say 10 minutes, to change to 20 instantaneously. You can do that, but it's much better to actually have that current value fade out and then the new value fade back in. And being able to animate the opacity value, which is what controls how opaque a control element is, that's a really good and effective use of animation that has nothing to do with moving the physical position of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting. That makes me think of, you know, if you, in that example, if you just suddenly, the number just suddenly changed, I mean, the end result is the same, but it kind of makes me think about a discussion I've had where, you know, there's a view out there that animations are just eye candy and are unnecessary or don't add value beyond appearance. But that to me is an example of one where, you know, the change and the gradual change in it could actually draw someone's attention. Like if you weren't looking at the number but it was in your peripheral vision, and you might notice that changing, so it actually adds to the effectiveness of the sign rather than just an instantaneous switch to a new value.
I remember years and years ago, actually it was when Microsoft was adding animations to WPF. Mm-hmm. And Don Box was giving a presentation about this, and he had talked about a very similar argument where people would always say that animations is overkill, we don't need it. And to a certain extent, there is some truth in that. I mean, if you look back at the websites of the 90s, where everybody was putting blinking text and you know, changing button sizes and stuff like that because you could, again, doesn't mean you should, but one of the examples that he gave that it still resonates today is that if he pulled out a box and he set it on the side of the stage, and he said that, well, if I want to move this box from this side of the stage to that side of the stage, it doesn't just appear on the other side of the stage. You see the transition that goes there. Now, it can be fast, it can be slow, but you see it, and it gives you context. And when you think about the way we interface with our applications, why do you think the mobile devices have gotten how they took off and become so usable so quickly is because it made sense. As you interacted with it, you saw the changes. You know, Apple did it with, you know, it's different pages for all the icons as you swiped. Android does the same kind of thing. You click on an app, you see the transition from one state to another, so you keep the user's context.
Yeah. Yeah, you kind of, it helps with discoverability. You're kind of teaching them the relationship between these things as it's happening rather than just suddenly a new screen appeared and they don't understand how that happened. Now they actually see it coming in response to some action of theirs.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's move.
I was going to add that the Google's material design does an excellent job of showing you where things came from and where things are going and how to interact with them. So, animations, you can do them wrong, but you can also do them to make it very much a more affordable, or provide affordances and provide describing the user interface to the users
Right, and that's the key here is that a well-defined interface that uses animations to convey information, but it's not for the sake of animation. If it's done right, you won't know if somebody were to tell you, oh, did you know that that animates? And you know, well, that's not even something I think to look for. It just becomes natural. But then when you see something where it's in your face and it's distracting, then they pick it up. So this question from Lance is interesting. It's actually similar to a discussion we had in the second webinar earlier today. What would you see as the best way to animate transition between multiple photos and slides? Jim will remember this because we had this in our session earlier. One of the topics came up with respect to this would be along these same lines. If you were building, say, a photo album and you had a list view with your albums on it, you tap on it and you go to another tab that represented the photo that you were looking at. And the question was, well, would you create another tab for the other photos and navigate through the tabs in the same way? And do you run into problems if you get to, say, 1,000 photos and things like that? And the approach that I came up with at the time, and I still stand by it, is that I wouldn't use the tab control for the photos themselves. I would use it for the views. So I have my list view for the albums, and then I have the second tab that would represent my photo viewing. But what I would actually be animating between would be the image controls that I'm actually using to display it on that tab. So I would have the one image control, and if I had a gesture for swiping or even arrows or whatever you wanted to use, I would then set up the next photo that I want visible, either behind the current one or to the left and right of it, and then animate that transition right on that same tab. And that would allow you to swipe through, and you're just rotating two different image objects, maybe three if you have to get ahead. It gets a little bit more complicated if you're going to do really long swipes, but you could build up a queue that would hold n number of photos to work through the animation. But that's how I would kind of tackle that particular problem. And where can I get radiant shapes? Can't find them on Get It Package Manager in 10.1 eval. 10.1, that's Berlin. That should be there.
Let me look.
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I'll defer that to Jim.
Although actually, no, I don't have the evaluation version of 10.1 installed, but I have the full version. So let me check real quick and make sure it's there.
Yeah. For 10.1 and 10.2, it should be accessible in the Get It Package Manager. For Seattle, I think there was a link or something available to get that, but I know for sure it's download. Yep.
I think Lance is just the discussion you were just having about the photo animations. He's just come back with a follow-up question, or with a confirmation.
Yep, exactly. So then with a kiosk, where no user control between photos, so you're controlling the transitions between them. Absolutely, load one, load two, and then transition between the two. Sure. I mean, then you start talking about, because it's funny because I'm looking at my screensaver right now from my Mac, and it's got like 8 photos that are all animating up from the bottom at different speeds. So you could do that as well, have n number of animations that you're taking care of.
Well, what's going on here? My computer is being really slow. It'll get there eventually.
All right. Anil's asking about a good component for a nice colored button on mobile. I guess it comes down to what you call nice. But I'm running from memory here, but didn't buttons in FireMonkey at some stage get a tint property? Isn't that to control the color, or am I misremembering?
It did, but that's the question. I have not looked, to be honest, I have not looked at the buttons on the mobile, the changes outside the defaults in quite a while. I don't know if the native rendering of the buttons gives you that control. or not. That's my only question about that one. But if you were going to use the native rendering of the, not native, but the FMX rendering of the control and doing it, I mean, you could, it supports all the styling, so you could customize the style to give the effect of the button that you want. And then when you do that, you can leverage any of the primitives that are available, which is one of the reasons why Radiant Shapes was built.
Yeah, so there's a tint color in there that you can use.
I thought that was.
But Jim, does that work when you do the native rendering? Or is the rendering only for edits and they're not yet for buttons?
It's only for buttons right now, and the native rendering is only on edits, not for buttons. So
okay, gotcha. So then the tint color would work, but again, it's going to mimic what the platform-specific buttons look like, which on iOS is really crappy because it doesn't look like a button. Yep, I said it. I dinged iOS.
Yeah, but it's true.
I know. I know.
Yeah, so there's tint color, and there is icon tint and font color are all three that you can change on speed buttons, and toolbar buttons.
And they're all animatable, if that's a word.
Yeah, they should be. Yeah, they should be. It looks like it. They got the little. Yeah. So one thing you can tell if they're animatable, they have the little film strip looking icon and text to them. And I'm looking at screenshots right now, and I see that. So, you know what? I launched 2 copies of Berlin at once, and for some reason, it's just not behaving itself now. I hate when I do that. When I get excited and double-click the icon and. Oh, there we go. I was on the VPN, and I don't know where I was. Okay, Radiant Shapes. I just turned off the VPN, and oh, look, now it works. Yeah, Radiant Shapes is there, so it might be not available in the trial edition. That's possible. Yeah, it's probably not available in the trial edition, I think about it, because when you download it, you get the full Radiant Shapes, and you don't get a trial of Radiant Shapes.
That is correct.
Have to get the full version. But if you have the full version of Berlin or Tokyo, it is in the Get Package Manager.
Cool, cool. All right, guys, any more questions from anybody? I mean, I'm happy to just sit here and have a chat, but it's the middle of my day for you guys.
It's the end of my long day. Well, not really, though. I got more work to do, but that's not part of the webinar.
There's always more work to do.
Isn't there?
Yes.
Keeps us busy, out of trouble.
What time is it for you, Ray? You're on the East Coast, aren't you?
I'm in the Central Time Zone by Chicago, so I am 8:16 in the evening.
Ah, it's not too bad. You've got hours to go.
Yeah. I'll be up for another 6 hours or so.
I don't think we've got any more questions coming in from anybody, so thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for joining at the end. That was unexpected, but very welcome.
No problem.
And just a reminder to everybody that we'll be back next week with more webinars in this time zone, so register and come along, and yeah, I can't guarantee we'll have a chat like this at the end, but you never know your luck. So everyone who's online, thanks for joining. Enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon, and have a good weekend.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.